Men of the 22nd Infantry, half frozen and exhausted by days of relentless fighting, were waiting for the new order to march into death. Inside the regimental commander's tent, a young captain known as Swede voiced without hesitation what was on everyone's mind. "Colonel, sir, I don't care if you break me for it. That little patch of woods we're fighting for ain't good to anybody. No good to the Germans, no good for us. It's the bloodiest damn ground in all Europe, and you make me keep fighting for it. That ain't right." However, the orders remained the same. An hour later, the captain announced to his men that they were attacking yet again. Many of his men would not survive another day in the darkness of the Hürtgen Forest. After the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Allied armies started to spread across France in a broad front. In such a vast territory, the German army had no means or men to hold the enemy's advance. By September, the American and British troops were at Germany's doorstep, the notorious Siegfried Line. Despite the fantastic success, the Allies were far from having no problems. What's more, the rapid advance to Germany had put them in serious problems. Allied troops in France were still supplied through small and improvised ports in Normandy. With the rail network destroyed, supplies were transported by trucks, the so-called Red Ball Express. It was a logistical nightmare that left frontline troops without enough fuel and ammo to continue their advance. Also, the fact that Allied troops were at the German border meant that the Germans were about to show much more resistance than they did in France. It was their fatherland that they were defending now. Indeed, the first attempt in September 1944 to break into Germany through Holland, known as Operation Market Garden, ended in complete failure. It assured the Allied commanders that breaking into Germany would not be an easy task. It also forced them to reconsider their strategies and take a different approach to breaking the Siegfried Line. Now, this was far easier said than done, as the Siegfried Line was a mighty defense line stretching 400 kilometers along the German border with hundreds of concrete bunkers, trenches, machine gun emplacements, anti-aircraft positions, concrete tank traps, and minefields. Eventually, a decision was made to tack the line at the city of Aachen. This city was important because it lay in an area of relatively flat terrain that would allow Allied forces to make a swift advance into Germany. It was also the quickest way to dams on rivers Ruhr and Rhine, which the Germans could use to flood the lowlands. The responsibility for taking Aachen fell to the U.S. First Army, while the main thrust to be conducted by the units of 7 and 19 Corps. The plan was solid, but there was one thing that bothered the commander of the 7th Corps, Major General Joseph Lawton Collins. It was a large forest area south of the Aachen known as the Hürtgen Forest, which was occupied by German troops. Collins feared that the Germans might break out of the woods and jeopardize his right flank. Although some believed that Collins was being overly cautious and that the Germans lacked sufficient forces to launch a counterattack, the Corps commander chose to play it safe and eliminate the threat posed by the forest. After all, he believed the maneuver would be an easy task for his 9th Infantry Division. No one at the time knew how wrong he was. His decision would prove to be one of the worst mistakes the Americans made during the war. The Hürtgen Forest was a dense, dark stretch of woodlands spanning 50 square miles of rugged terrain, where every step was a challenge for the soldiers. The trees, thick and interlocking, created a canopy so dense that it felt like entering a dark cave. This blocked out much of the light, making it difficult for soldiers to see and move. Paths through the forest were narrow and winding, surrounded by steep hills and fast-flowing streams, perfect for setting up ambushes and obstacles. The weather in the forest at this time of the year was mostly rainy, turning the ground into deep mud and making it even harder to walk or drive through. The constant moisture also meant that soldiers were always wet and cold, which wore down their spirits and strength. The forest conditions posed not only a physical barrier, but also a mental one. The reduced visibility from the thick foliage and omnipresent fog often caused units to lose contact with one another. This led to confusion and fear among soldiers, which was aggravated by the eerie sounds of combat and the screams that echoed through the forest. However, the harsh terrain of the Hürtgen Forest was just one of the problems American soldiers had to deal with. The other was a well-planned defense system that Germans had built. The core of the system was the network of concrete bunkers and pillboxes connected by trenches and fenced with barbed wire. These strongpoints were deeply embedded into the hillside, making them extremely hard to destroy. They were also positioned in such a manner to cover every possible approach. The carefully planned placement of bunkers and pillboxes allowed the Germans to create zones of interlocking fire, where attacking forces could be hit from multiple directions. This elaborate system made it nearly impossible for American soldiers to advance past the strongpoints without suffering heavy losses. To defend their positions from armored tanks, the Germans reinforced the woods with dragon's teeth, large concrete obstacles designed to prevent tanks and vehicles from passing through key areas. Another important part of the system were minefields, hundreds of them. The Germans planted various types of mines throughout the forest floor. The worst were the bouncing Betty's mines, designed to spring up from the ground and explode at waist height, causing devastating injuries. Both the Dragon's Teeth and minefields forced American troops to move through narrower, more dangerous paths where German forces could easily target them. The ingenuity of the system was that it was designed not only to stop the enemy, but to wear it down. To make matters worse, bad weather and dense forest deprived the Americans of air and artillery support, which they had heavily relied on throughout the campaign. Due to these factors, which U.S. Army commanders had underestimated, the Battle of Hürtgen Forest turned from what was expected to be an easy campaign into one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The first to enter the Hürtgen Forest were the men of the 9th Infantry Division. Their first steps were met with little resistance, but it was only until the Germans realized what the Americans were trying to do. On September 15th, things changed dramatically for the Americans as the Germans started counterattacking, using tanks and infantry. Soldiers of the 9th Division had to retreat slightly as they had difficulties halting the advance of German Tigers, especially without the support of their tanks. An interesting story from these days involved technician 4th grade Clarence Ed Combs, a cook within the 47th Infantry Regiment. One morning, as he prepared breakfast, a giant Tiger tank appeared in front of his cookhouse. Reacting swiftly, Combs threw away his meat cleaver and grabbed a bazooka. A precise hit from the rocket launcher into the hull forced the German crew to leave the vehicle. Once again, without hesitation, Combs opened fire and killed every one of them. This act of courage was later used by men of the 47th Infantry to make fun of Combs. They joked how they wished Combs could cook the way he fought. By late September, despite the difficulties, soldiers of the 9th Division moved deeper into the Hürtgen Forest. However, with each step, they faced more and more difficulties, having to deal with defense obstacles and constant German counterattacks. To make it worse, the trees and the fog made it hard to see, and the ground was filled with mines and traps set by the Germans. Soldiers often had no idea where exactly they were and were afraid to move on. Their only hope were the engineers, who worked tirelessly facing constant danger to clear paths through the minefields. On the other side, the Germans showed remarkable resistance, forcing the U.S. soldiers to fight fiercely for every inch of ground. The battle became a back-and-forth struggle, with neither side giving up easily. Indeed, in these last days of September, American gains were measured in mere yards. As October came, the battles grew even fiercer. The weather worsened, making the fight more difficult. The ground turned to mud, soaking and chilling the soldiers as they tried to advance or hold their positions. It all took a toll on the 9th Division, which was on the brink of collapse. They had fought bravely, but lost too many men to keep going. By October 16th, the division had pushed some 3,000 yards into the forest, but at the cost of 4,500 casualties. They were relieved by the troops of the 28th Infantry Division. The Keystone Division, with a proud history dating back to George Washington's time, had fought in numerous wars and was well equipped and trained by the time of World War II. Under the command of General Norman Daniel Dutch Coda, they were thrust to the fray of the Hürtgen Forest to continue where the battered 9th Division had left off. However, despite their experience, Coda and his men were shaken by the devastation they encountered. Shattered trees, scattered equipment, and weary soldiers of the 9th Division emerging with haunted looks, bearing the scars of battle. Behind them were hundreds of fallen soldiers whose bodies were being retrieved from the forest. As November approached, strategic demands to break through the Hürtgen Forest intensified. With the First Army in a stalemate position, Koto was ordered to capture the town of Schmidt. It was a maneuver that was supposed to cut German vital supply routes. Koto was not happy with the orders he was given, as he was well aware of the formidable German defenses. Additionally, the Germans had become familiar with the American intentions and were certain to bring reinforcements to the area. On November 2nd, combat operations resumed in the Hürtgen Forest. The battle began with an American heavy artillery attack aimed at weakening the German defenses. The intense bombardment was supposed to be supported by an air attack, which unfortunately never came due to the thick mist. Units leading the charge were Colonel Strickler's 109th and Colonel Peterson's 112th Infantry Regiments. Along them fought men of the 110th and 12th Infantry from the 4th Division. The German soldiers, well entrenched in their bunkers, were ready for the American assault. They waited out the bombardment in their shelters, aware of the incoming attack. When the American soldiers advanced, they were met with fierce resistance. German machine guns and mortar fire were so devastating that the Americans had to stop their progress due to heavy casualties. But the orders were strict. The town of Schmidt needed to be captured because it was a key road center, making it vital for the German defense. The Americans pressed on. On November 3rd, the 3rd Battalion of the 112th Infantry, led by Colonel Flood, caught the Germans by surprise. Instead of advancing in a large conspicuous group, which was the expected tactic, his battalion moved quickly and quietly, managing to enter the town before the Germans fully realized what was happening. Once they reached Schmidt, Colonel Flood acted swiftly to organize the town's defenses. He set up what was known as hedgehogs, small, isolated defensive positions that support each other without forming a continuous defensive line. Flood decided to take this approach as he didn't have enough men to form a complete defensive perimeter. This method created overlapping fields of fire and made it more difficult for the Germans to overrun any single position without facing resistance from another. However, without sufficient anti-tank weapons or support from American tanks, the question remained how long the battalion could hold the town, especially with the Germans having called for reinforcements. On November 4th, the German forces launched a counterattack, bringing the 116th Panzer Division into the fight. Using both infantry and tanks, Germans attacked American positions at Schmidt. The Americans in the town were overwhelmed. German Panther tanks, immune to the light American bazookas, rolled through defense positions set up by the Americans. Back along the Kahl Trail, which connected the beleaguered battalion with the main body of the division, American tanks and infantry tried to advance to support the comrades in Schmidt. However, the path was too narrow and was crumbling under the tanks' weight. Stuck in the mud, American tanks and infantry became an easy target for German artillery and mortars. Desperate officers tried to maintain order and advance, but the chaos and battle of the dense forest hampered their efforts. Colonel Peterson of the 112th witnessed his regiment suffer under relentless German fire. Command decisions became increasingly difficult as officers struggled to relay orders and receive accurate reports from the front lines. It was just a matter of moments when everything was going to break down. Soldiers were experiencing extreme fear and exhaustion. The continuous threat of German fire, harsh weather, and rough terrain pushed many to their limits. The number of those who were breaking down under stress and were unable to continue fighting was enormous. In the worst moments, some abandoned their posts or were unable to function, overwhelmed by the horror around them. In such an overwhelming situation, there were soldiers who kept their composure and even went beyond their duties. Medics, under constant fire, worked tirelessly to treat the wounded. Under inhumane conditions, they treated the injured soldiers, sorted them for transport, while marking each of them on their foreheads with morphine dosages. Back at the field hospital, the heap of amputated limbs grew, and the air was filled with the cries of men. Yet the medics continued their grim work. As night fell, the situation for the American soldiers in Schmidt and along the Kahl Trail became dire. German counterattacks intensified, forcing the American forces to retreat as they struggled to hold their positions. Discipline broke down, leading to complete chaos in the American ranks. Many soldiers, overwhelmed by fear and fatigue, fled back through the forest, leaving their positions and equipment behind. In confusion, many soldiers fled eastwards, straight into German hands. The German advance, however, didn't stop at Schmidt as their tanks moved forward along the Kahl Trail. With more powerful engines, wider tracks, and an improved suspension system, German Panthers had fewer difficulties crossing muddy terrain compared to American tanks. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 112th Infantry managed to hold their position until November 8th. That day, an order was given to all units of the 28th Division to retreat their initial positions. Yet another attempt to break through German lines in Hürtgen Forest ended in failure. Once again, the Americans suffered severe losses. The 112th Infantry was decimated. Out of 3,000 men who had gone into action, around 900 returned unscathed. The 28th Division lost about 45% of its strength. Such an outcome was for the most part result of a series of poor judgments and mistakes made by the division command. When devising a plan to capture Schmidt, General Cotta did not consider the 9th Division's experience with the forest environment and the German defense system. At the beginning of the engagement, he decided not to use tanks to support the infantry initially because he believed the forest was too dense. If only he had consulted the 9th Division commander, he would have learned that this was not right. This decision had severe consequences as it allowed the Germans to dominate in the early stages of the battle. Later, tanks proved crucial in certain areas, helping the infantry advance and offering much-needed support. However, that was when Cotta made another mistake by choosing the Kahl Trail as the main supply route without checking it first. It turned out to be a muddy and narrow path, nearly impossible for vehicles to pass, especially under enemy fire. This decision proved costly. Supplies and reinforcements could not reach the front lines at Schmidt, which weakened the American defense of the town. Unfortunately, the list of bad choices went on. In a desperate attempt to hold ground, General Cotta ordered more attacks despite the clear indications that his forces were overstretched and suffering. This approach not only resulted in failures to achieve objectives, but also inflicted significant psychological and physical strain on the troops. Persisting with offensive actions without sufficient preparations or support ultimately caused a complete breakdown in discipline and the collapse of the front. One commendable action by Cotta was that upon realizing his division was on the verge of destruction, he successfully persuaded his superiors to allow a withdrawal. However, this was far from the end of the battle. Despite how pointless it was, Army commanders didn't want to be beaten by Germans. The pride of the U.S. Army was at stake, and its soldiers were about to make one more sacrifice to save it. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest continued as part of the broader Operation Queen. Allied commanders intended to make a mass assault on German lines, aiming to reach the banks of the River Roer and capture its important dams. Also, Roer would serve as a staging point for the subsequent advance towards the Rhine River. For this to be achieved, General Omar Bradley, in charge of the Army Group, decided to engage troops of both the 7th and 5th Corps. This particular area of the Hürtgen Forest, precisely its northern edge, were to be assaulted by troops of the 4th Division, 7th Corps, and 8th Division, 5th Corps. On November 6th, over 1,000 bombers flew over the Hürtgen Forest, dropping 4,000 tons of fragmentation bombs on the towns in the forest's outskirts. The devastating air raid was followed by an assault of the 4th Division, which was ordered to capture the village of Grossau. Thousands of young Americans stepped into the thick woods. They, too, like the men of the 9th and 28th Infantry Divisions before them, would come to know all the horrors of the forest, which soldiers had grimly named the Factory of Death. The killing began almost immediately as the men of the 4th Division's 22nd Infantry Regiment in particular faced German machine guns and mortars. However, this time, after thousands of lives were lost on both sides, the savagery reached a new level. This was best described by a story of a soldier who stepped on a mine deep in the forest. With his foot blown off, the poor man couldn't move and had to wait for help, slowly bleeding on the forest floor. Unfortunately, there was no way medics could reach him because of the machine gun fire from German bunkers. However, he was approached by German soldiers who used him to fix a spring-loaded explosive charge under his back. Anyone who would try to lift him would be blown to pieces. After 70 hours, medics finally came to the wounded soldier, unaware of what lay beneath him. During that long period, the wounded soldier struggled to stay conscious so he could warn others about the mine. The medics cut the wire of the booby trap and carried away the wounded soldier, saving his life. The savagery of the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, in which no one was spared, not even medics and chaplains, was taking its toll on the men. While some succumbed to the combat exhaustion, others went berserk. One such was First Lieutenant Bernard Ray of the 8th Infantry, who volunteered to blast a way through a line of barbed wire that was holding up the whole regiment. Dragging a Bangalore torpedo, Ray crawled toward the barbed wire while the rain of bullets flew just inches above his head. Not even a mortar shell that exploded beside could stop him. Bleeding heavily and his body riddled with shrapnel, Ray pressed on. Once he reached the wire, quite calmly, he set off the detonator attached to the Bangalore torpedo. The wire was ripped apart while his body disappeared in the explosion. Unfortunately, despite Ray's brave action, the 8th still couldn't get through that wire. The entire 4th Division was in no better situation. Their progress was too slow as they simply couldn't breach the stiff German defense. After 5 days of bitter fighting, the division had progressed only about 1.6 miles but had already incurred 1,500 casualties. Ultimately, they reached Grossau on November 25th, but could still not capture it. Meanwhile, the 8th Division joined the battle by launching an attack towards the town of Hürtgen. The unit was practically thrown into battle after a grueling 172-kilometer night drive through fog and rain, immediately followed by an 11-kilometer march through sleet and mud. With the 4th Division struggling, there was no time to waste. The pressure on the Germans needed to be constant. The 8th Division attacked practically without prior preparation. The assault commenced under extremely challenging conditions. Temperatures were freezing, and the forest floor had turned into a pool of deep mud, making movement for both men and vehicles nearly impossible. To make matters worse, as soon as they engaged the enemy, the division faced heavy casualties. However, despite the unfavorable conditions, the division's soldiers pushed forward, slowly but steadily. On November 25th, they attacked Hürtgen, supported by the Reserve Combat Command from the 5th Armored Division. This attack was repelled by German anti-tank units, but 3 days later, the town fell into Allied hands. The following day, the 4th and 8th Divisions attacked and captured the villages of Grossau and Kleinau, respectively. The Germans attempted to disrupt the 8th Division's advance by counterattacking at Castle Hill near the town of Bergstein, but their efforts were in vain. On December 7th, the 5th Corps reached their objective, the Ruhr River. The 4th Division, however, was not so successful. Although they continued their advance after the fall of Grossau, their casualties had reached a critical level. Since November 16th and the beginning of the fighting, they had lost about 6,000 men. With so many soldiers out of action, there was simply no way the division could continue fighting. On December 3rd, it was replaced with the 83rd Division. The success on the northern edges of the forest affected the situation throughout the rest of the forest. After suffering heavy casualties in early November, the 112th Infantry was relieved by the 2nd Ranger Battalion. On December 6th, following the advance of the 8th Division, Rangers attacked the village of Bergstein, 2.5 miles north of Schmidt. They captured the town as well as Hill 400, the important strategic position overlooking the Ruhr River. After they accomplished their tasks, Rangers were replaced with the troops of the 13th Infantry. On December 15th, Germans launched a massive counterattack and recaptured the hill. Although it appeared that much fighting still lay ahead, this was the final day of the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. On December 16th, to the Allies' great surprise, the Germans launched the Ardennes offensive. In just one day, the focus of the entire front shifted away from the forest where thousands had lost their lives, accomplishing little in return. The battle ended in a stalemate, but was in fact abruptly cut short. Although it brought victory to neither side, it certainly came at a great cost to both. The Americans had suffered 55,000 casualties, while the Germans had 28,000. The casualty rate of 25% on the American side was preposterous, especially for a battle which had no particular importance. In February 1945, after the German defeat in the Ardennes offensive, American troops cleared the Hürtgen Forest of the remaining small German forces, including those in the Kahl Trail in the town of Schmidt. The official U.S. Army history of the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest labeled it a victory. However, men who fought in it knew better. The true story about the horrors in the Hürtgen Forest was never revealed to the public. It was bad for the morale of the nation. The generals responsible for the disastrous conduct of the battle will never admit their mistakes. After the war, Major General Joseph Collins, who had ordered the advance of the troops through the Hürtgen Forest, would become a man of influence. In 1954, President Eisenhower sent him to Vietnam to assess the situation. Collins suggested that the United States should get involved in the conflict. It seems that thousands of lives lost in one of the bloodiest battles of World War II were no lesson to Army commanders. This was certainly true for the Chief of Staff of one of the units that suffered the most casualties in the battle, the 9th Infantry Division. His name was Colonel William Westmoreland. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, please share and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out our Patreon if you're a fan of the channel. Stay tuned.